Good day, everyone. With the release of our local fixer finally here, I could finally try him in the Abyss with Hu Tao to see if he could make a Hu Tao team that I am properly pleased with. And what better way to test this, of course, than to see how they do in the second round of 2.2's Abyss. Now, at the same time, I also wanted to test out how well an R5 Amenoma Kageuchi could have Ayaka's ultimate up at C0 with no other battery. And so even though it'd probably make more sense to put Hu Tao's team in the first half, as it's a bit more single target, let's say the Magukenki, I decided to throw Ayaka in the first half to specifically test that, and then put Hu Tao in the second half to check out the Hu Tao and Thoma team. Now because of this, usually one would kind of just show the whole run as you would go through it, but as I specifically want to talk about Ayaka and Hu Tao and Thoma, and don't want to have to continuously jump and forth back between them, I'd figured I'd take the run and instead just split them in half so that we could see the first half all the way through and focus that bit on just talking about Ayaka, and then watch the second half all the way through while we talk about Hu Tao and Thoma. And also then, if you only were interested in looking at Hu Tao and Thoma, you can simply skip to just that one bit and then watch it through. Now, starting off with Ayaka, the point of this run is mostly just to see how the Kageuchi fares at Refinement 5 at getting Ayaka's burst up without having another cryo unit or anyone acting as a real battery. And in the current Abyss, there's no better test for that than the Magukenki, as pretty much all the other rooms have multiple enemies that can all be frozen and more or less gathered together, which means her ultimate will easily tear through all of them, and doing so will give her the energy that she needs to be able to cast her burst, and so she doesn't really need a battery in these scenarios to begin with. Now, as you can see, the Anemo Traveler is in this party with Ayaka, and this is because Sucrose is in Hu Tao's team, and I don't have any other Anemo character that can gather enemies, so we shall have to make do with our avatar, which obviously is not ideal, but for these chambers, we can make work. And as usual with Ayaka, this chamber is pretty much just gather the enemies into a decent little clump and then burst them down. My clump is rather obviously not quite as good as it could have been, but with a bit of practice, you most certainly could get all three of them in a nice little spot to AoE them all down. Now, coming into the Magukenki, as usual, since we can't attack him for basically 10 seconds, you might as well use that time to get up any energy that you don't have, and with this round's buff, try to make sure that you get to 100% energy so that you can start gaining those damage stacks which you will obtain from using your burst. And we can see here that the Anoma Kageuchi actually did a pretty decent job at getting Ayaka's energy back up. Now, to be fair, this is really only because we have extra time due to his invuln phase, and that we want to wait for him to teleport back into the wall, and so that he won't end up teleporting away from our ultimate, which ended up giving us an extra skill cast. But even so, it definitely does do a decent job. It's not in ordinary circumstances going to be able to give you all of your ultimate by itself on cooldown, but I do think it's definitely a viable option if you don't want to be running a cryo battery, but instead, say, another buffer. The final chamber is pretty much the same as last time, really, with this comp. Basically, just let the enemies come to you, throw down your buffs, and then AoE them all down for the first wave. And then moving on to the second wave, head towards one of the ranged enemies, kill it while doing damage to the Ruin Guard following you around, and then move to the final ranged enemy and do the same to it. I wanted to see if I could get one of the ranged enemies to do his teleporting backwards into the other one so that we could AoE them all down at the same time, but unfortunately, hitting it made it deactivate, and so I wasn't able to see if that could happen. Now we can move into Hu Tao and Thoma. To talk about how we might want to build Thoma, there are some things to keep in mind. And the major thing there is that his shield scales with HP, and his damage also scales with HP, but by a very small amount. And because he doesn't have very large base HP to begin with, if you want to be having him with decent shields, you're probably going to need to go HP percentage on the majority of your artifacts. And so if you have to go, say, an HP percentage headpiece and an HP percentage goblet, he really just isn't going to be doing much damage. And so I'm not sure that it's really worth even trying to spec him into a damage build. Now, because of this, and because of a false assumption I made, I decided to give Thoma the instructor set with energy recharge, HP, and HP, and having my rotation being Xinqiu into Thoma, into Sucrose, and then Hu Tao. And the reason for this goes a bit further than simply trying to use the instructor set on Thoma, but more to do with Sucrose and Viridescent Verena. Because the ordinary way to use Thoma would probably be to start with him, then swap to Sucrose or Kazuha, Viridescent Verena and give out the Elemental Mastery or damage bonus, into Xinqiu, and then get into Hu Tao's rotation. The issue with this is Xinqiu takes somewhere along the lines of like 2 to 3 seconds of field time, and Viridescent Verena, for example, only lasts 10 seconds. And so if you go about using that rotation, by the time you get to Hu Tao, you're only going to have the Viridescent's resistance shred for about 6 seconds of Hu Tao's rotation. As 1, there shouldn't be any pyro to swirl, and 2, because Viridescent only will work if the character who's using it is currently on the field. And so doing the Xinqiu, Thoma, Sucrose, and then Hu Tao would allow Sucrose to resistance shred right before swapping into Hu Tao, and so you should be able to have the enemy's resistance decreased for almost all, if not all, of Hu Tao's rotation, instead of having it for only about 2/3, assuming that you don't have to, say, dodge an attack or something with Xinqiu, which would then lead to even less time. Now, the reason I thought this would work is because, generally speaking, the characters in the game who have abilities which hit a single time will apply the strong version of their element. Kaya's elemental skill, for example, applies strong pyro. Bennett's elemental skill and his burst apply strong pyro. And so, because Thoma's elemental skill hits a single time, has no other damage associated with it, I assumed that he would apply strong pyro, and thus, with his elemental skill, be able to fully remove Xinqiu's weak hydro application, and then the initial hit of Thoma's burst could apply pyro for Sucrose to then swirl. The issue here is that, unfortunately, for some reason, both Thoma's elemental skill and the initial hit on his burst apply weak pyro. And so, his skill and his burst combined will only remove the hydro element having been applied by Xinqiu, and not managing to put pyro on the enemy for Sucrose to swirl. So, unfortunately, Thoma does not work as well in this team comp as I had assumed that he would, which I definitely do feel is a massive shame, as if his skill could apply strong pyro, or even just the initial hit on, say, his ultimate, I do think this could have been Hu Tao's, at least one of Hu Tao's absolute best team comps, but instead, it's probably not that much better than, say, just using a sub DPS to fill in damage while Hu Tao is on cooldown, and maybe throwing Diona and Yoimiya or Dailuk into the team to have the shielder healer, and then a character to deal additional pyro damage while Hu Tao is on cooldown. And so, in terms of how to build Thoma, the instructor set probably doesn't make any sense. And once again, as if you want him to have decent shields, you'll probably need to use like an HP percentage goblet, and circlet means that he just isn't going to be dealing damage unless you do give him a crit rate, crit damage circlet, and a pyro damage goblet, in which case he's not really going to be giving much in the way of shields. And so at that point, I'm not totally sure why I'd even be using him. So artifact wise, I think it's pretty much two choices. The first is to use 2-piece Tenacity for more HP, bigger shields, and then 2-piece Emblem of Fate set for more energy recharge, or to just use 4-piece Noblesse, which will increase Hu Tao's damage a little bit. It's not going to be much of an increase, but at the same time, it will also give Xinqiu 20% more attack. We can actually probably make more use of that. As even run as a support, Xinqiu can still do a very decent amount of damage. And now, while this might not be the highest damage or most survivable Hu Tao team comp, it does allow you to run Seisukros or Kazuha to gather enemies together so that you can attempt to hit them all at the same time, which is really Hu Tao's biggest weakness, is that her charge stacks are extremely single target, and so this can be a massive boon. And so while it might not be the best damage team comp, it might be one of the best all-round team comps, because you can more easily deal with AoE situations, at least the ones where you can gather enemies. And so to sum up, this is a good team comp, allowing you to run an Anemo character to be able to deal with Hu Tao's biggest weakness is, I think, probably the biggest perk of having Thoma. But I do have to say, I feel rather disappointed. I don't really think he makes much sense in pretty much any other team for the most part, as with his low ICD means he can't be an aura character, and as you will either have to build him for damage or for his shields, he's pretty much just going to be there to be a shielder that doesn't heal, unlike some other shielders in the game, or a damage character that doesn't really do much damage, and so why isn't Zhengling just here instead? Which honestly I do find to be a significant shame, because his shield mechanic, for me, is by far the most interesting. The shield so far in the game I found to be pretty boring. It's, you hit it, you have a shield, and then once it takes enough damage, it goes away. Whereas Thoma's, in gaining little tiny bits of shield, essentially making sure that you always have a shield, even if it's not blocking all the damage you take, rendering you practically immune to getting interrupted in any manner, is extremely cool, and I was definitely looking forward to him, and really thought he would kind of allow for the absolute best Hu Tao team comp for people who don't have Zhongli and Albedo. But that's about it for my thoughts on Thoma. How are you feeling about Thoma? Have you used him with Hu Tao? And if so, how are you liking it so far? Do you think it's your best Hu Tao group yet? Or is it not much different from other Hu Tao teams you've used before? Have you found any cool uses for Thoma in other teams? Or did you roll in this banner not for Thoma, but instead for our beloved funeral director? Do let me know, along with anything else you'd like to tell me about, down below in the comments. Thank you for watching, look forward to seeing you again next time, and hope you all have a great day.